Asia sees record temperatures while Spain is running dry. It's only May, and this year is already shaping up to be even warmer than 2022, one of the hottest years on record. A recent report says statistically implausible heat waves are happening. So how do we prepare for what's to come? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is our warming climate. For weeks now, Asia has seen temperature records shattered. Last month, more than 100 students in the Philippines were hospitalized for dehydration after a fire drill was carried out in exceptionally hot weather. In India, high temps are taking down health as well as hurting the economy. More than 100 billion hours of labor are lost, on average, every year in India due to extreme heat. In Spain, farmers are warning they may not have a crop this year as the majority of the wheat and barley harvests will be lost due to prolonged drought. And a new report says we should now be over-preparing for almost inconceivable events. So, can we mitigate the damage to come? Here's a look.
Spain is engulfed in a heat wave, and residents are struggling to stay cool.
I'm coping so badly with this, even more so because it is so early. We are still in the spring.
The unseasonably high temperatures are following years of low rainfall and drought in some regions, stoking fears of a repeat of last year's devastating fires. In 2022, the planet was 1.29 Celsius degrees warmer than it was a century ago. And as the temperature rises, heat waves are becoming more frequent and more intense. The last 8 years have been the warmest on record, and climate scientists warn that this year's global average could reach an all-time high.
The warmest year was the 2016, according to our report. So we are expecting in the coming 2 years to have a serious increase in the global temperature.
Heat waves have affected communities on every continent. According to researchers from the University of Cambridge, more than 24,000 people have died due to heat waves in India since 1992, and more than 90% of the country is at risk. Extreme heat threatens food and livelihood security, destroying crops and livestock. The Horn of Africa is currently in its worst drought in 40 years, and more than 20 million people are facing acute food insecurity. And heat waves can cause deaths and make existing health conditions worse. Europe's heat waves last year claimed the lives of nearly 15,000 people.
Elderly people who are taking many medications, go more often to the emergency service, and we are unfortunately expecting an even greater peak of pressure on ER services, even though the system is permanently stressed.
According to a report by the World Meteorological Agency released last month, there are 2 hotspots that are likely to feel the brunt of the climate crisis.
Number one is Arctic, and second largest warming we have seen taking place in the Mediterranean region, and this negative trend is supposed to continue for the coming decades anyhow.
That means the Mediterranean region will become warmer and drier, and coastal areas will be impacted by sea level rise.
We have already emitted so much of especially carbon dioxide to the atmosphere that this kind of phasing out of the negative trend takes several decades.
Unfortunately, governments have fallen far short from the pledges they made in the 2015 Paris Agreement. And as long as humans continue to burn fossil fuels and destroy carbon-storing ecosystems, new records will continue to be set. With a long, hot summer approaching, the question remains, is it now too late to reverse the damage?
Well, joining me now to discuss what, if anything, can be done to mitigate the worst of our ever-warming climate are from Kathmandu. Deepshikha Sharma, she's a climate and environment specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. From Cambridge, UK, urban engineer Ronita Bardhan. And in Lleida, Spain, is Resco de Dios, an associate professor of forest science and global change at the University of Lleida. Thanks all so much for being with us. Deepshikha, I'll start with you. You know, we've been breaking climate records for years, but we're still not really taking the serious action needed to reverse it. So how dangerous are these extremes now, especially these heat waves?
So thanks for inviting me here, and thanks for talking about the heat waves. It is extremely dangerous, and so just to highlight a bit more on how it is linked with. So I'm coming from Hindu Kush Himalaya region. ICIMOD works primarily with the HKH, and the range is from Afghanistan, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, Myanmar and Pakistan. So the range is quite big. And we see that this is one of the most vulnerable, and on the front line of the climate crisis, catering to a population downstream and in the region itself is more than 1.9 billion. And more than 240 million are living in the mountains. So heat waves are becoming frequent, intense in the region with significant impacts on human health, ecosystems, and livelihoods. Just to give a little bit of glimpse of what HKH is. So in your video, it was showing the Arctic, but I think this is equally important. It has the third largest ice reserves, 4 global biodiversity hotspots, 10 major Asian river systems, and of course, even the 1.5 degree pledge, world glaciers in the region, it will still lose a third of their volume by the end of the century.
Oh,
so this is basically a very much...
Yeah. Did you ever expect it to reach the levels it's reached? Or did you see this coming because you've been looking at the climate for years now?
Yeah, it's been quite there, and there has been many, I would say, evidences supporting this. If you see, there has been a lot of GLOFs, which we say glacial lake outburst floods, which has happened in the region. It has happened in Nepal. It has happened in Afghanistan. It is one of the impacts of the increased temperatures. And downstream, when we see on the plains, we see a lot of people, as also demonstrated in the video which you just shown. It's the impact on the livelihoods, it's the impact on the biodiversity. So there are noticeable changes, and these are all human-induced, I would say climate change is the major cause of the growing number and ferocity of heat waves, which we are seeing across Asia. And recently also there was a huge, big, dangerous heat wave which just hit the region.
Right.
So yeah, there.
Ronita, let me ask you, I mean, we understand different places will have different experiences, but how prepared are we in general for these types of heat waves? As we said, it's barely May, so even hotter weather is likely to come over the summer, especially, obviously, in the Northern Hemisphere now.
That's absolutely correct that we are going to see much more impact of the heat waves in the coming years. It is going to become more recurrent and more frequent, and that's also more intense probably. And because heat is a slow killer, it often gets unnoticed, although it's a good step that most of the countries in Asia are now recognizing heat as one of the climate burdens, and it's a climate actions are being taken towards it. India specifically has 37 heat action plans, although how they were made and what it includes or entails is needs a relook and needs to be reassessed. But I would say we are gearing towards that preparedness. We are not really yet there, while also seeing that the effect of the heat will become much more intense in the coming years. The space of the preparedness needs to be much more intense and much more targeted, rather than having a knee-jerk reaction through.
So how have we been gearing toward that preparedness? What have you seen done that makes you say, okay, at least I'm seeing some steps, and then what's still missing?
Yeah, so in last year, actually, it was after, I guess, around 122 years after where India saw a massive heat wave in April. And that was a starting point of actually recognizing heat as one of the major burden. However, in 2015, the first heat action plan of one of the Indian cities in India was prepared in 2015, which was Ahmedabad, and that, I think, is the starting point of the preparedness. My major concern is we are gearing towards the preparedness without a concrete framework, without having guided direction, which makes me think that whether the intention of the preparedness would yield the results that is looking for it. So the results might not be as expected.
You know, it's interesting because we have talked a lot about in the media the disproportionate effect on poor countries because of the flooding we saw in Pakistan, for example, the rising sea levels that are really affecting particularly countries in the South Pacific. But now we're seeing these heat waves as well. But Victor, Spain is a developed country, but is still seeing horrendous extremes, not least, you know, heat and drought. You've seen the wildfires. I mean, tell us what's really shocked you most about what you're seeing and what should be or should have been done about it.
What's shocking me most about the current situation is what's happening with the crops in particular, because this heat wave is building upon a long-term drought, which probably has exacerbated the current heat wave. And we have the water levels in most dams, in most water reservoirs, they're really low. So in some dams, we don't even have water for the fire crews to put out fires, which is not a concern in terms of firefighting safety, but it is an indicator of how low water levels are. So right now, most of the crops, the irrigation that's happening in the crops, is not for yield, it's just for survival. It's to ensure that tree orchards do not die. Because if they do die, that's going to have some long-term consequences upon agricultural production. So right now, the yields for this year are compromised, or the agricultural yields are compromised, which likely means higher prices, higher food prices down the road. And if we don't manage to keep the trees alive, this is going to mean some long-term damage to the agricultural areas here. So this is what is most shocking for me.
Right, and you're talking about your immediate context in Spain. We have to remember Spain is a huge exporter of food. What kind of choices might the government actually have to make about what's done for domestic production and what is allowed to be exported? And could that become controversial because it means likely less income for certain farmers because they won't make the kinds of margins they make on exports?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have the agricultural market is right now, there is being a lot of abandonment in the field right now because the prices have been going up because of the fuel crisis, the energy crisis that has an impact on the fertility prices. So there's been lots of abandonment in the last few years. So now on top of that, we add this long-term drought, and this is going to have very dramatic impacts on the production,
Deepshikha, speak to us as well about what similar conditions in Asia. Will they also be struggling with food production, which also massive exporters throughout the region, but they're going to need that domestic production, especially when you have a country like India, now the most populous country on the planet?
Definitely. So it'll have an impact on the changing, patterns of the crop yields. Definitely, there's going to be a food security issue, and also the water security issue will be big as well, because water scarcity is another significant impact which we have studied also over the years, and we have seen a lot of impacts due to heat waves. So it is kind of connected. Biodiversity, changes in the biodiversity is also going to be the major impact. So it can actually yield to a different kind of creation of different ecosystems, so the collapsing of the current ecosystems over the years. So I think it is very important to understand the impact and the ferociousness which heat waves brings along with. So yeah,
what do you want to see done right now? Is there a decision a government could make that could fundamentally change the outlook?
No, I think it is very important, and also, like the esteemed panelists have also implied, that the governments need to take this, very concrete measures on the heat waves, considering that yes, it is due to the climate change, induced climate change. Secondly, I think what is important is to see how we can have, food security, water security in the region, and also very importantly is also on the investments coming into the place. So there has been a lot of talks globally about loss and damage frameworks, which is majorly linking with the disasters. And this is also a very catastrophic effect, so it needs to be treated like that. It needs to have its own kind of financing mechanisms to deal with such kind of, situations ending up in livelihoods of the people as well. So I think it's very important to get the investments in place and directed in the right direction for adaptation and building resilience for such actions.
And I mean, that is looking at large, kind of international solutions for some of these issues. But Ronita, you've said we are actually overlooking some rather somewhat simple, I should say, local wisdom that would actually just protect people, while helping the environment when it comes to dealing with heat like this. Tell us what you're talking about there. I mean, how do we start building differently or rebuilding now?
Right. So we should understand the area which is currently seeing a massive heat wave. Heat is not alien to that particular place. People have lived with heat. There's a thermal history. There's a memory of dealing with heat in the local cultural context. However, because this ode to develop cities, to look them at as world cities, have changed that outlook, and the local wisdom to combat with heat, the local building materials, the local way of designing buildings or cities, or the local context of there's so much inherent cultural food intake during different seasons. The seasonality of dealing with heat to keep our bodies active and to not fall ill to heat is not alien to this region. However, if we look at any of the policy documents, or if we look at any of the current practices that is trying to mitigate heat, is often overlooks these adaptation strategies, and there's no mapping of these adaptation strategies that are inherent and are within the memory. I think the memory will be short-lived if we start overlooking at it and start running towards achieving this world image of development where every city looks similar. Also, these cities have different climate zones. So what solution works in northern part of India will never work in a part of in the western part of India, which is much more humid. So just transplanting solutions from one part of the world to the other actually doesn't have as impact or effective as it had been in that part.
You mentioned humidity there. I just wanted to ask about that quickly because, when we talk about these record high temperatures in certain areas of Spain, these are incredibly dry climates. Right. I know coming from the United States, people talk about, Arizona gets so hot, but it's dry heat, so it's okay. When you have those, between 40 and 50 degrees, we're even looking at temperatures with 98% humidity, how does that change the dynamics?
So first of all, that's where we worked and said that there isn't any indicator when governments declare that there is a heat wave coming. It's always temperature thresholds. However, heat is felt by the people, which is a combination of temperature and humidity. And that's where if there is a very high humidity, the body mechanism of perspiration and sweating that allows the body to cool down stops, or it inhibits at very high humidity surroundings. And that's when it becomes difficult to cope with the heat, because your body is no longer able to sweat and give the thermal comfort, the desired level of thermal comfort. Another aspect is once the temperature crosses the core body threshold, the thermoregulation process of our body gets stressed, and that's when heat waves impact more. And this thermoregulation process is a combination of humidity and temperature. And hence, I think instead of looking at, and that's why we suggest a very simple solution, heat index. Heat index tells us it's derived from occupational spaces where stress has been studied for a long time. Right. And this indicator kind of directly tells us that what would a person actually feel in a particular combination of temperature and humidity, and not just temperature being an indicator of it.
Right. So, Victor, let's look at the Spanish context. I mean, we talked about there's often that dry heat in Spain. Still, people have to deal with that, and it can prove fatal. And really, the only solution we have at present for the immediate term is for everyone to just boost their air conditioning, which is almost one of the worst things you can do for the environment at this point when you're talking about millions of additional people consuming more electricity, and what comes out of air conditioning harms the environment as bad as anything does. What is Spain going to have to do, especially in anticipation of this summer to come?
Well, I think what Spain should do should have started to occur 20 years ago. I think it's important to remember that, for instance, in 2001, the IPCC, this panel from the United Nations that releases the reports on climate change, they already said that, there are many uncertainties about climate change, but we know that heat waves are going to be more common in the future. We're not sure of what's going to happen with the rain, but we know that heat waves are going to increase in frequency. And then we had the heat wave of 2003. That was quite horrendous. That was in summer. And the death toll in Europe was about 70,000 victims. So the 2001 report was ignored. 2003 came in. 70,000 people have died. The death toll, it is true that it has reduced over time, but still we are far from being ready in that area. We are not taking climate change seriously enough. The measures that we're taking are sort of makeup.
And it's so interesting because not only, especially in the case of Spain, are people not necessarily taking it seriously, some people are actually celebrating it. I mean, you have so many British tourists, for example, that are running to Spain and saying how wonderful it is to have these beautiful, warm, sunny days that they're enjoying more than anything. And it makes the whole world fail to understand that this is not a good thing. Let me go back to Deepshikha quickly. We only have last 5 minutes left, and I actually want to speak to both of you about this because, as is usually the case, the poor and even women are most adversely affected in all of this. So Deepshikha, quickly, explain how their survival is most being undermined.
It's extremely being undermined, and women and other, if we see it from the JC perspective, it's marginalized communities. So it's related directly with especially coming from the mountain regions, So there is already a crisis to get the water. There are already issues for that. So, and then when these springs are drying up, due to the heat wave, when the other I would say catastrophes are happening, and then the water issues. So it's going to bring a lot of challenges for the women, especially in the I would say the rural areas. Although the governments are trying to promote the last mile connectivity for water, and there have been some huge successes there. But I think what is important is like what I would say Ronita was also mentioning about is some of the very, very local solutions, and since it's going to impact severely on the both food and water security. So it is important to look it through that lens, and also IPCC, it has been proven, it is there. So first of all, to understand that there is a direct impact already there which exists. And just to come back to your question also on the the kind of the heat waves, and if we see in India recently and other parts. So it is and it is not in this part we have been living in the humid and heat conditions, very warm temperatures and very high temperatures. So not a new phenomena, but yes, the extremities, the impact, the way it is coming very quickly early in the year during the summers, it has changed a lot of patterns. It has changed a lot of lifestyles, and and then suddenly then the rain comes, then again the heat comes. So there has been very, very erratic changes in the weather. So it is going to be very, very for the marginalized communities as well.
And I want Ronita's thoughts on that as well. Down to our last minute and a half, I know you specifically said that women are one of your biggest concerns and how they're adversely affected.
Especially, I would say, just continuing with what Deepshikha said, women often in this part of the world, which we are talking about, Asia, do not have a lot of agency towards cooling devices, to operate cooling devices. It's primarily linked to women staying major part of their day inside their homes, which makes it much more which makes them much more vulnerable towards using cooling devices to heat. However, increasingly we have seen women do not use it because they do not have the agency to operate it. They don't want to take the burden of increased electricity bills, especially in low-income marginalized communities. Women often report not using any sort of intervention because of this whole notion of being more resilient is a good citizen and being a good housewife. The definitions of these local definitions of being having been able to absorb more risk is often seen synonymous to women's resilience, and that's celebrated in major parts of this world. And that puts a huge amount of burden, because even at high temperatures, they will not seek for any sort of intervention. And especially it becomes much more evident and more clear in the marginalized communities where the access to cooling devices is much lower.
Okay.
This is where I see solutions of social cooling becomes much more important.
Okay, Ronita Bardhan, that will have to be the last word, because unfortunately we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.